Hey, Mike.
Hey, Caleb, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. What are you drinking tonight?
I'm drinking a classic Manhattan, bullet rye, sweet vermouth, and some really nice cherries and some special bitters. So I'm quite enjoying it. How about yourself?
I am closing out Negroni week here by having a Negroni. At the time of our taping, we are in the waning hours of Negroni week. So I'm having one last Negroni this week. And I figured we could dive back into our autonomous car discussion.
Yeah, and actually we had some great discussion over the past 3 episodes on the Reddit subreddit as well as on our comments. And one that stuck out to me was a listener was talking about a supposed conspiracy theory in Los Angeles. And then right before the show you were mentioning you had some context for this.
Oh, yeah. When I lived in Seattle, and I lived in the central district of Seattle, and the roads were always a little gnarly, and they were talking about paving over them, and they were having problems because they had just paved over the streetcar tracks in the middle of the streets. And that just kind of blew my mind because I was having to walk everywhere and I have a Vespa scooter, so I was Vespaing around. And it would have been so nice to be able to just hop on some sort of public transportation, but apparently it had all been paved over. And yeah, in researching that, I had stumbled also upon the GM streetcar conspiracy.
Which is what?
Which is this, well, I think it sounds pretty legit, but it is a conspiracy, technically, I guess. I don't know. I'm not sure. But the idea that as cars were becoming the sort of
predominant method.
Yeah, the predominant method of transportation, that the car companies were gaining political clout, and there was a lot of local political action towards destroying or migrating away from the existing streetcar lines, which were pretty popular in most large municipal areas, and paving over them in providing more accommodations for cars.
I see.
Back when cars weren't as ubiquitous as they are now, so this is kind of, you're thinking of even before the 57 Chevys and the sort of classic cars, this was before that. And yeah, that there was a lot of monetary interests that were kind of pushing things in a certain direction that may or may not have been ideal for the towns, but were ideal for the companies that were selling all the cars.
Yeah, and the people buying them, to be fair. I mean, a lot of people wanted to own their own vehicle, and they needed a place to drive them. And streets back then, before our roads were really designed for cars, were very dangerous and slow places for cars, both for the drivers and the pedestrians. So,
the horses that were still on the roads. Yeah,
I mean, that's an interesting one, right? This that might be sort of the best metaphor for what's about to happen. We're going to have horses and cars on the road, and the modern day equivalent is going to be self-driving cars and cars being driven by humans.
So the humans are the horses in this analogy?
Yes, the humans are the horses, and they're quite nice, but we don't need them doing this particular job anymore.
Indeed.
So this week, I guess we wanted to talk a bit more on some of the practical elements of self-driving vehicles in the future. So what happens to the physical cars, what happens to the regulatory environment that will allow cars, and how that might sort of shape out what happens to insurance, and sort of dig into some of those topics. And this might be the last episode in this series of self-driving cars. I'm sure we'll revisit it.
Oh, shut your mouth.
I know. I'm sure we'll revisit it soon, but this is sort of the last in our planned series, I guess. So,
do you remember how many episodes we have until the Model 3 is released?
I haven't done the math, but mentally it's definitely quite a few. So it really depends on when we decide to claim victory of making it. The first vehicle on the road that is a driver by Tesla or SpaceX employee, or is it production? So that could be months of extra episodes. But anyways, where do you want to start, Mike? We've got a roulette of options, so let's spin that wheel.
All right, I just spun it, and let's say it landed on insurance. Insurance is probably a little specific, but this idea of the whole regulatory regime around how we are comfortable getting in vehicles and just hurling ourselves through our built environment at 70 miles an hour. Part of that is insurance. Part of it is car safety.
Yeah.
Part of it is just this, oh man, I forget who, there's a famous quote about how anything that was invented after you were born is like scary
normal
technology, and everything that was beforehand is just the way things are.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And yeah, so like right now we're in this environment where buying a car and paying monthly auto insurance is just normal, and that's what you do. And you turn 16 and you take a driving test and you get your license, and that is just, it's crazy to think of anything else. And I think self-driving cars are the biggest jolt to that system that we've had, certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's right. And that definitely resonates with me, that quote. And I remember that being brought up, especially in the context of smartphones and all sorts of previous technology, that it definitely tends to separate out that way where, young people, children who are born in the past decade, a touchscreen, every screen they see is perceived to be a touchscreen. They want to touch. They want to see
magazines and newspapers. They're touching.
Yeah. They're swiping. They want to see a photo instantly. Even for me, the idea of having a photo instantly is starting to wear off. But I remember when you had to take the film and wait a week before you could get it back, and 24-hour photos was a pretty big innovation.
You dinosaur.
I know, I'm ancient. But I guess sort of stepping back, the reason that we have car insurance and regulation around cars is to our earlier conversation about cars being very dangerous and dangerous things causing damage to person and property. And so our governments have created rules to try and mitigate the risk of these vehicles because we've deemed them necessary for modern society. And so we've sort of have this bargain where we know they're dangerous, but we want to create some sort of regulatory framework to protect us. And we've elected the government to do that for us, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting how, if you travel around the world too, how different that can be. Like, I was in Thailand late last year, and it was astounding to me. I read earlier, before I went, that Thailand was one of the deadliest countries in the world for auto accidents. And then I arrived there and spending time in Bangkok, and it is just utter chaos. The number of scooters and cars and these little tuk-tuks that are flying around, and it's
flying.
Well, not flying, but
okay.
Well, sometimes I guess. I don't know.
Both wheels off the ground.
Yeah, the roads are mostly in good shape, but yeah, it certainly, once you start getting out of the city, it can get a little hairy. But yeah, it just kind of gave me a little bit of perspective on how it is just a sort of societal agreement that we all have, that we've all agreed that this is going to be a thing, that we're going to drive on the right side, and that we're going to watch a certain speed limit, and we're going to behave in certain ways. And it's it's very not organic, but I don't know, it's nebulous, I guess, or
I mean, it's just this combination of both social norms on how you deal with traffic, how you deal with people in vehicles, that there's a general sense that it's baked into the law that vehicles need to yield to pedestrians and cyclists, all the way to the fact that many states, at least in the United States, have no-fault insurance policies, which essentially mean that if you get into an accident, they're not even investigating whose fault it is. It's just generally built into the policies that it will be paid for, because at this point, the accident rate is actually quite low in the U.S. Relative to where it was before seatbelts in the 50s and 60s. And that it's just sort of baked into the premiums.
It's interesting how it when you have a slightly different social environment, like you have in, say, Russia, that you end up with these sort of follow-on effects of dash cams are huge in Russia. And the only reason we have so much evidence to that recent meteorite or meteor, whatever, the one that kind of came down, was because so many people driving around in Russia have dash cams because there's so many problems with insurance where people are jumping out in front of cars or causing accidents, and that people have taken this defensive posture of installing inexpensive dash cams on their cars that are just recording what they're doing all the time.
Well, what's funny is that every single Tesla also has a dash cam. It's just not exposed to the user. And I know you've talked about and thought a lot about what's going to happen when all these vehicles' data is being used for different purposes beyond just the self-driving capabilities in the moment.
Indeed.
But we could jump back to that. But I guess jumping back to the insurance, I guess so the laws of the road currently dictate that licensed drivers must be operating vehicles, which seems obvious, but one of the challenges for the self-driving and autonomous vehicle movement is that up until now, both Google and all of like Mercedes and Volvo and Tesla, who have been doing experiments with fully autonomous vehicles, have had to have steering wheels and accelerators and brakes in the vehicles because under the current U.S. regulation, at least, and I believe it's international as well, cars, the definition of a driver sort of implies that there's going to be a steering wheel because it's implied that it's going to be a human.
Right.
And so the law was not built with the assumption that a computer would be able to be a driver. And so up until extremely recently, for the past decade of this research, all autonomous vehicles have had to have someone, a licensed driver, sitting in the driver's seat, even though the vehicle was driving itself, and that driving itself is actually a computer on board acting as the driver.
Right. Similar to how planes and autopilot work, where when you take a flight across the country, most of that flight is very well conducted by the autopilot, but there still is a licensed and accomplished pilot there ready for taking over whenever necessary.
Actually, two, right? There's the pilot and co-pilot. I mean, planes have a human redundancy minimum, and then things like Air Force One have multiple pilots in the event that two of them get incapacitated.
And then Harrison Ford can take over too, if absolutely necessary.
Yes, exactly. And refuel. And so I guess one of the things that's been interesting is that Michigan has recently changed their law so that a computer can be deemed the driver, and so they are not requiring people to be in the vehicle. And also at the federal level, which is also required, the National Highway Safety Traffic Association has allowed it so that you don't need to have a steering wheel or brakes and accelerator. So that clears the way for other states to allow that. So basically that's really important because if you want to get to level 4 autonomy, which is full nirvana level autonomy of the vehicle doing everything and you can fall asleep, then it doesn't really make sense for there to be a licensed driver sitting, being able to be there in a steering wheel, because you don't need a steering wheel in that case. So really and interesting. And that was just a few months ago. That was just February, of this year, of 2016. So within the past 8 months or so, there's been changes to the legislation, less than that, 5 months, that allow vehicles to be built and sold potentially without steering wheels. That's a lot of change in 100 plus years of having a steering wheel.
Is there any sort of, so when a human driver gets behind the wheel, they presumably have a driver's license. Is there any sort of plan for testing these vehicles, kind of like crash tests, where the government will run driver tests on them?
So the rule expansion is just for testing purposes. So the government hasn't yet laid out the regulations and certification process for self-driving vehicles to be sold as such. But they just needed to even clear the roads, as it were, to allow these vehicles to be tested on public streets. And so Google and others work with the federal regulators as well as the state regulators that allow self-driving vehicles. And at this point, there's over, I think, 16 states that have publicly come out and said, and through legislation allowed self-driving vehicles in some capacity. Michigan, as you might expect, Michigan is where the car industry in the U.S. is primarily situated, with Detroit being the central hub. California being a quite progressive state, as well as a technologically advanced state with many Silicon Valley companies working towards self-driving vehicles, and folks like Mercedes and Volvo having research centers here. Nissan also has a recent research center focused on autonomous driving in California. So the California has done it, and also Nevada has very forward-thinking legislators. So it's currently believed that California, Nevada, and Michigan will set the tone for self-driving regulation because they're some of the most populous states in the context of California, and then also very strong thoughtfulness / cooperation with automakers in Michigan. And then Nevada is just sort of the wild card generally.
Does that have anything to do with the Gigafactory being there, do you think?
I'm not sure. It might be. I think many of the states want to be on the forward-looking aspect for self-driving, and Florida just came out and added some self-driving forward-thinking thoughts as well. And many of them want to attract vehicle manufacturing and also just be in good graces of these technology companies to set up research centers in their states for the job creation. And so they are currently deeming it worthwhile to allow them to be there, because right now you couldn't drive cross-country in a self-driving vehicle legally. And so each of these individual companies needs to test it in states where it's currently legal. So one of the hurdles that's been identified by many, including Elon Musk, is that the states really do, at least in the U.S. and then worldwide, need to come to some sort of benchmark regulatory framework that will allow self-driving vehicles, because it won't work if you try and drive cross-country in the U.S. and you have to your vehicle isn't legal in one of the states you need to pass through because it doesn't have a steering wheel.
Yeah.
And so
same with driver's license. Like, it wouldn't be very useful if you had to be relicensed in each state.
Yeah, and I mean, we figured this out with driver's licenses, and it's pretty amazing that it works. I mean, you can have an international driver's license and go a lot of places and be deemed a driver, even though you haven't taken that local test. And also that the vehicles themselves, there's a very strong economic incentive for the vehicles to be able to be sold worldwide. And so you can be sure that many automakers are lobbying and using a lot of their funds for lobbying to ensure that the laws that are put in place are minimal and consistent. And
especially with regards to trucking too, that we talked about earlier too, because if you can't have an autonomous truck that can be legal in every state, then it's really not that useful for interstate commerce.
Exactly. And one of the other things too is that on its back, and the really sort of positive aspect is, as we've talked about in the past, is the safety aspect, where the automakers want to prove very clearly that these vehicles are safer. And so it would be irresponsible for the states not to allow it, and be consistent with other states. So what's interesting is, in the context of insurance, insurance is a multi-$100 billion industry in the U.S. and $1 trillion industry worldwide for personal automobiles, commercial, and personal injury from automobile accidents. And one of the things that has been happening in the context of self-driving vehicles is insurance will change. And the primary reasons are insurance premiums are built on actuarial tables, so sort of statistical models around how many accidents are likely to happen based on things like how old you are, how long you've been driving, what gender you are, what state you live in, what vehicle you're driving, and all of that is going to get mixed up pretty dramatically when it's a computer being the one who's actually driving.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you think about like right now, it seems like a given that you have auto insurance. It's just like almost a tax that you pay to be able to drive. but you don't actually pay for like a train insurance or a taxi insurance or a subway insurance for other ways that you get around. There's no airplane insurance. So when it becomes a method of transportation that you yourself are not in control of, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and what's interesting is many folks in the industry have pointed that out, that as transportation in vehicles and cars becomes much more like you pointed out, like trains and planes and
automobiles.
And soon automobiles in that category, that it will fall to the service provider and also as a pass-through the manufacturer to be liable. So in a plane accident, it is both the insurance that the carrier, so the Delta or United or Virgin America or Virgin Atlantic carry, pays for it. If there's a mechanical failure, Boeing or Airbus is also partially responsible. And then also the government step in the case where there's some big repair that needs to be done, because they view it just as sort of a general good and thing that the general population is going to pay for because it happens so rarely. And one of the interesting cases that came up as an example for this sort of no-fault concern is you could imagine that the price of insurance could be quite high still, or that maybe no individual person has insurance. It's just you have to pay for it because we know that you were the one who caused the accident because you took control or you did something weird. One of the concerns was that was similar was this idea that vaccinations, sort of far afield, but if a vaccination were to cause a child to die, there was a big fear that no parent would take their kids to be vaccinated. And so there was actual special laws added in the U.S. at least that would put the manufacturer wasn't necessarily at fault, and the government would pay for any issue if there was sort of a bad batch. They would then do an investigation of the manufacturer. But in that way, manufacturers wouldn't be afraid to create vaccinations because vaccinations were considered a public good. And so they didn't want to create a framework where people would be afraid to produce vaccinations because they were needed.
Right.
And
so like 1 in a million still means when you have 300 million people that there might be 300 people that will.
Right. And that might be a very, very large settlement if your vaccine was seen to cause the death of many children.
Yeah.
But it saved hundreds of millions of other children previously. And so there have been some legal scholars who've sort of proposed that a similar system be put in place for autonomous driving, that the public good of autonomous driving is so great that even though there will be accidents, that the rate of accidents will be so low that the government should be prepared to foot the bill, and that we sort of collectively pay for these insurance incidents because the likelihood of needing the insurance goes way down. So what's interesting is that hurts the insurance industry quite greatly because 250,000 or so people are employed by the insurance agency in the U.S. alone. And even people who own insurance companies like Warren Buffett are very cognizant that this is coming and have stated publicly that they think it's good that autonomous driving is coming, that the constant improvement in safety has been sort of in progress since Ralph Nader really started pushing seatbelt laws in the U.S. Many decades ago, and that insurance premiums have gone down over time because the cars are safer to insure. But he cautioned that it's going to be many, many years, and he's not doing anything right now to prepare.
Yeah, it's interesting that you can kind of foresee a lot of things that will happen when all cars are self-driving, and then there's the way things are now, and it's that sort of interim period that's kind of fascinating. Right,
because there will be some autonomous vehicles soon, and I don't know if you go and get a Geico policy if it will take into account. I mean, I don't even think that Geico or Progressive or any of the major auto insurances in the U.S. take into account that the Tesla with autopilot is a safer vehicle. And when will that start happening? I think that's really interesting. It seems as if that won't happen until the data has been made much more public. And Tesla's already said that they're going to share this data with the U.S. Department of Transportation if they want it. And so that can then become part of the public record. And so then that would be a public verifiable source that insurance companies could use in their models that, oh, you're driving a Model 3. It is a much safer vehicle, and therefore your rates can be lower. And that will continually, be a slight economic benefit to those people, which will drive more people to want to purchase those sorts of vehicles. So it may start tipping very slowly, but safer vehicles are cheaper to insure, and so they tend to be more desirable. The counterweight, obviously, is that these vehicles will probably be more expensive because they are brand new tech vehicles that start at the high end. And so the counterforce to that is that expensive vehicles are expensive to insure because they are more costly to repair in a catastrophic accident, which is more likely these days than the fender benders and things because they're just generally safer.
Well, and they're designed to self-destruct to save the occupants with all the crumple zones and stuff. But I think the important or the encouraging part is that it's hard to imagine a less politically important demographic than the insurance companies. I mean, no one is crying for the insurance companies. Everyone views it as this sort of burden that they have to pay. So if I don't think they have much political clout other than their dollars. So that's probably pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, I also think it is a very competitive market. I mean, and that's a positive thing, that there are many, many insurance companies and they fight very much. The number of advertising dollars spent on insurance is extremely high because it's such a long lifetime value. And so insurance companies are fighting very hard to get you to switch. We've all seen those ads. And so if they come out and have a policy for those who have self-driving cars and how much cheaper it is, they will be able to be more profitable, and they will want that, and they'll get more customers. They know it's cheaper to insure. So I kind of think that the insurance companies, with the profit motive they have and the very competitive industry they're in, will take to this in stride. And I'm not foreseeing a huge issue with the insurance companies. I think the regulation issue is more troublesome just because the cycle time is so much slower and there's less political will to be associated with something that potentially could come back and fight, sort of hit you in the face as a negative when the first person dies in an autonomous vehicle in your state. That is not going to be a very pretty day. Even though there are thousands of people dying in your state every year from regular auto accidents, that will not be the headline. And so that seems like the riskier thing. But again, the political clout already seems to be shifting. So that's promising that there's already ways for these autonomous vehicles to be on the road in testing purposes. So yeah, and Tesla, Volvo, Mercedes. Mercedes and Volvo have come out and said that they will be responsible for the insurance. They will take on the liability in their autonomous vehicles, and they've said that publicly. And so I think that also is a strong sign to regulators that these companies are willing to take on the risk, and that's a very big financial risk if something were to go wrong. So that's definitely easier for the regulators to point the finger at the car companies.
Yeah, definitely. But humans are always going to be involved. I was just in South Carolina this weekend, or last week, and I was driving to a coffee shop there, and in one direction there was a sign over the street that said, "Drive safely. 398 people have been killed so far this year in South Carolina," which it is June now, so not even half a year. And then on the way back, I'm driving, and in front of me is a man on a motorcycle with no helmet on his head, but one helmet fastened to the side of his bike, not wearing it. So I don't know. I feel like there's this whole like hashtag humans problem to deal with. We don't make the best decisions.
Yeah. So,
Anywho.
that's tough. Can't explain those guys, the humans.
So how about we pivot into like what will the autonomous driving do to what a car actually is?
Yes.
Like, what does it look like? What does it do? What do you have for thoughts on that? Like, how will autonomous driving change what we think of as a car?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple big things, and I personally wrestle with two diverging outcomes. Actually, three diverging outcomes. So,
well, they're not diverging at that point.
Sorry, three separate vectors exiting from our current point.
Gotcha.
Okay, so but if I step back, the big thing is we've already had driverless vehicles, and they were stagecoaches. The people inside the stagecoach were rich and enjoying their leisure time on their very long journeys across the country and across the world. And they had drivers in the front piloting, the horsemaning the horses. And the people inside the carriage were enjoying the lap of luxury in a very nicely upholstered...
Sort of. I mean, it was a pretty rough ride.
It was a rough ride. I mean, we didn't have airbag shock absorbers. But basically, my point is, I think we will have a return to that concept of a...
Kind of a limousine effect.
Yes. Where the vehicle inside for the cabin compartment will be unrecognizable from a vehicle today, where the orientation of sitting and the overall quality of the experience inside will be elevated to the point where it is more like being in first class on a train than being in a car.
You don't have to go back to stagecoaches either. There was an interesting article in The Economist last year or the year before about how celebrities in LA, they specifically featured Dr. Dre as one of them, are buying these sort of customized vehicles, mostly vans and Escalades, from this company that makes essentially mobile offices. And they just have a chauffeur so that all the time they're stuck in the LA traffic, they're able to still do things. They're able to essentially have a mobile office or watch. I think Dr. Dre had some quote about watching Martin Scorsese movies to relax. So yeah, it seems something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the big thing we get back individually from self-driving vehicles is time. That we can reallocate time spent looking out the windshield driving to some other activity. And so the question in my mind on the physicality of the cabin is that directed to short-range activities like listening to music, watching a TV show or a movie, where the cabin can be like a first-class cabin or a really nice limo, where it's still intended for sitting in for a few hours, but not for a day or two.
You're still obviously in a car at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Or does it go the other way, where it becomes more like the experience you just had of a cruise ship, but mini, like an RV? And is it much more like an inhabitable space that moves, and it happens to be very small relative to your normal home, but everything that you would want to do, you could do on the go? Those are two areas. And then the other, I guess, layered on, I misspoke. There's actually four. It's sort of a quadrant.
Oh my God, we went from 2 to 3 to 4.
I'm sorry. So then we'll dig into them. The other two axes, I think, are personal ownership to company shared ownership. So a la Uber, Lyft, Didi, all those folks. So I own this vehicle. I paid for it with my own hard-earned money or have a loan on it. To I summon a vehicle of my choosing, and I don't own it. I am using it as a service, similar to an airplane, unless I'm uber rich. So
No pun intended.
Right. So those are the four components that I see. What am I missing? And maybe just jump into those concepts and what do we think it's going to be like and what time horizons?
Yeah, no, I think those are interesting ways to break it down. I'm very partial to this idea of self-driving cars kind of becoming RVs, essentially. But I think that is in stark contrast to... I think RVs are hyper-personalized, and it's essentially your home at that point. And anything that is a utility, I guess, is inherently less personal. Like when you're flying on an airplane, you have a carry-on bag, and you have to make sure that everything that you took in with you is with you as you're leaving because it's no longer your space.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in our current personal car environment, there is a strong bias towards that being your personal space, and people make it very personal in that there's all their stuff that might be there. They might have, no matter how dangerous it is, people have things on their dashboards that become flying projectiles in an accident. They might have things stuck to their dashboard that become extreme projectiles when their airbags deploy.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter. It is a space that you're in for so long that you want to personalize it.
I guess,
kind of like
yeah.
being in a cube farm or something, right? You want to personalize what little bit you have, like a cube farm or jail cell.
Yeah, I guess I would push back though. Like, I guess the hotel is a concept where you similarly, it's a shared space, but there are hotels that are far nicer than my home. And I like them more because they're cleaned for me. They are very nice and compact and kind of fun to go visit, try something new. So
I totally agree with that. And I think that for me, that is definitely true. I think that the idea of this like car culture, at least in the United States, is very strong. And I think that is a strong countervailing force that we're going to have to fight, or maybe it's generational too. Like millennials aren't buying cars at the same rate and aren't as excited about it. So maybe those people are just sort of dying off.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with Uber, I use Uber quite a lot, and I think you do too, and Lyft and those guys. And I certainly enjoy when I get a nicer car on Uber. Like, there's definitely a floor where I don't like getting the '96 Corolla. That's not a fun experience being a passenger.
It's just weird when you don't get a Prius.
Right. Yeah. Or sort of or sometimes I'll do the Select if I'm going to the airport or coming back late from the airport, which isn't as nice as the black car, but it's still like a nice BMW or something. Like it is nicer, right? Having that slightly premium experience. And, but there's some transferability in that concept where like a generally nice car is still much better than a really low quality car that's 20 years old.
Sure.
So
it's more comfortable for one thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more comfortable. It's more confidence inspiring. I feel like there's a lot of signals. So
you don't want to be worrying about the crash rating of the vehicle as you're stepping into the back seat.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't, so I would hope that it's sort of on par or better than the type of vehicle I personally would choose to drive. But being the passenger, I don't really care about the driving dynamics as much. And also one of the other really intriguing components of this is when you're being driven by someone else, you would much prefer they drive with like an egg under their foot, where they're very careful to accelerate, very careful to decelerate, and take turns extremely gently. Like you just want to be comfortable.
Right. Ludicrous mode isn't all that exciting when you're not the one pushing the pedal.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the interesting components for Tesla is that they've had such a strong desire to compete on performance, which is actually sort of a more old-fashioned vector of competition for vehicles, where you're appealing to a buyer who is going to be the driver. And in a world where the buyer may not be the driver, the buyer may be a private equity firm or a ride-sharing company, and what they're looking for is lots of room. Like the Lincoln Town Car is not a great driving car, but it's got a ton of room in the back. It's very cushy, and it generally exudes a sense of executiveness, at least that we think so.
Well, it's great driving for what it is, right? It's very, very boat-like. It has a very suspension that just hides all of the road, so it's designed to be very smooth.
Right. So in the context of self-driving and a fleet service where you're not owning the vehicle, you're not ever going to drive it under your own control. What vehicles become interesting in that regard are very different than the ludicrous, Tesla Roadster.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And
so
it's interesting that like the ludicrous like Roadster BMW level performance is not even something that you actually get to use in practice on today's roads. It's really more of an aspiration, or of maybe some sort of like idea of what you could do on the Autobahn or something. But driving around the Bay Area in California, you're really not using that very much.
Right. And it's something that you use to differentiate and talk about your own personality. But when you're choosing a ride service or an airplane, I don't feel a personal attachment to being in a McDonnell Douglas plane versus an Airbus versus a Boeing. It doesn't say anything about me which plane I choose because it's not even a choice I have.
Yeah, and they never talk about which plane takes off faster or flies faster. I mean, since the Concorde has been retired, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That's a characteristic that the purchaser cares about. So Uber and Lyft and Didi and all the future companies are going to care a lot more about, how quickly it recharges, how durable it is, how easy is it to clean, all of these different factors that today, when it's a single owner sort of concept, is not nearly as important, right? I guess the closest analog would be rental cars, and unfortunately, rental cars sort of get the bottom barrel cars because they buy so much and they get sort of the leftovers from the automakers that they miscalculated consumer demand for.
Yeah, and I think maybe even the right analog would be apartments or like you say, hotels, where I really do think that the future of self-driving cars is more like, I had tweeted about this earlier, that like I'm just waiting for the day where Winnebago can sell me a self-driving RV, because at a certain point you don't even need an apartment. And this is going completely to the other end of the spectrum, where it's
really far in the future,
hyper personalized, and pretty far in the future, where why do you even need an apartment? Maybe you have an RV type vehicle that is self-driving and it drops you off at work, and it just goes out somewhere to like the cheapest like parking area based on whatever the parking rates are for whatever sort of on-demand parking service there is, and it comes back and picks you up when it's time to get off of work, and you get in it and it drives you around, and maybe you don't even need to actually park anywhere, or maybe you park somewhere outside the city and it drives you back in at some point, or maybe drives you into a different area. And you just wake up at work, you shower and you get out of your vehicle and boom, you're right there. You don't have to actually worry about a commute. It's just something that happened while you were sleeping.
Yeah. And the other thing is that it can be driving around all the time. So the idea of owning land, or physical space that you own is unnecessary. I mean, it could be parking in a parking lot at night, or driving at a very slow rate somewhere in a herd of all these other RVs. They sort of clobber together and drive in a pack, a caravan. I mean, it's fascinating. I haven't heard that many people talk about this concept. So if anyone has heard more or heard any talks, I'd love to dig into it. But
surely it's got to be out there. I'll throw out, here's my free business idea for anyone who is still listening to our inane ramblings this far into our episode.
Mm-hmm.
If you have money, buy up some of these abandoned, decrepit suburban shopping malls and install charging stations in the parking lot and make them into town squares, so that when self-driving RVs are a thing, they will take people from their offices, and you will decide which little town square you want to go to for the night. Your RV plugs in, you walk out of your RV and you go into the town. You have restaurants there, you have stores, you have a whole little like town center, and then you sleep in your RV, and at a certain point in the middle of the night, your RV just detaches from the charging station, drives you out to your office based on how long it's going to take to get there, and boom, you wake up at your office.
So turning a mall back into a mall.
Yeah, I mean, well,
but a mall of the future.
Well, that's the thing is like, and I don't want to get too much into this, but like what we know of as suburban shopping malls in the United States were not originally designed to be what they became. Like the man who actually invented them had this idea where they would essentially be town squares and town centers where people would come and congregate and shop and eat. And essentially, he got like one or two of them developed, and the developers decided, oh, well, we can just make them their own thing and surround them in seas of parking. And it sort of took off, and it's kind of a tragic story. I forget the guy's name, but it's kind of interesting if you want to look him up.
So that would sort of imply, so that is an ownership model, right? Like instead of buying a home, you're going to buy this decked out RV Autobot version.
Buy or rent. I mean, if you're renting an apartment,
I guess you could, you
could just
could
rent
pay
one
monthly.
of those. Yeah.
And you could upgrade over time as you get a family and things like that to bigger and bigger ones, like the 18-wheeler ones or whatever.
Right. I mean, even the idea of like the size, permittable size of vehicles is totally based on what humans can control. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have there's even the 18-wheelers that are double hitched.
Right,
that's
or
legal.
triple hitched in some states.
Yeah, so you could imagine that's quite a large house. If people are living in shipping containers today, as
just look in Dwell magazine.
I know, I'm looking at one right now. Multiples, I need to read them. So that's one path, and I think that's viable. I think that will take a lot longer, right? Because the societal impact of like, wait, you live in your house? Like, I guess there are people. I mean, there are definitely people who live in RVs and travel, but it isn't something that young people do. It tends to be more of a retiree, like explore the world because of the working. Right. Like usually you work close to where you live, and it's where you work is fixed.
Right.
But that may be changing more and more. I mean, our company that I work at is half remote already. So it would also be possible that potentially your office is in there and you're working remotely as you're driving around to wherever you want to go.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, or it could be just facilitating your commute. Maybe you're working remotely, or maybe it's actually just bringing you to your office while you're asleep. I guess in multiple person households, that becomes a little more confusing, and you start to get into a traveling salesman problem. But at some point, you could figure out a way to do that. Dropping kids off at school,
Yeah, so then the opposite end is Google's vision that they've shown of these little prototypes that are two-seaters. They're very cute, plastic, bubbly looking.
Almost like a VW Beetle in a way.
Yeah, like a half-size Beetle. And this is their latest version of their prototype self-driving car. So they started with the Priuses that they were modifying for highway driving. Then they modified the Lexuses for more advanced sensors. And then they realized that to really go to the level 4 that they really wanted to, they needed to improve a few things. So firstly, modifying someone else's vehicle has its inherent engineering disadvantages. There's challenges around the sensors being able to see as well as they would hope. And so one of the reasons the cars are so bubbly is that they wanted all the angles to fall off and away from where the sensors are, so that they wouldn't, none of the car would actually be obstructing sensors. So that makes sense, but also
that brings it back to what we were talking about last episode or the episode before about blind spots, and how that doesn't necessarily make sense because you're not a human sitting in a specific singular place in the vehicle.
Yeah, as long as the sensors can be mounted in a place where there is an inherent blind spot of the car's own mass.
Right. You could put 4 eyes on 4 corners of the vehicle, whereas a human has 2 eyes facing forward.
Right. So those cars are better there. And then the other thing that they were saying was, one, they wanted to make it look cute and unassuming. Unintimidating, so that it would be more accepted by people. Yeah. So thinking about sort of the anthropological and cultural impact of the car and what this computer driving it will signal, and not wanting to look intimidating.
Didn't you pay something to me today about the noises it might make too?
Yeah, so one of the other things that they've been doing is making sure that the cars interact with humans well when they're driving. And one of the things that humans do when they drive is they honk the horn. And self-driving cars up until recently have never honked their horn. They had never been instructed to do so. And there's nothing in the DMV handbook about honking except for that you really shouldn't do it. And so it was sort of this gray area of, well, should these cars honk? And so Google recently published a paper about how they went through the process of allowing their self-driving cars and building in the capability of honking, and honking of different types, right? You sometimes double tap the horn real quick, just to sort of signal to someone if they're doing something a little silly but at low speed in a parking lot, maybe about to back into you. So now the self-driving cars will double tap honk and do these little pips to indicate to someone that's backing into them that they shouldn't, because maybe the self-driving car can't back up because there's someone else behind it. And a human driver would indicate to them, hey, through the horn, what are you doing? Don't back into me. And then also being able to indicate more strongly with a solid horn that they, that someone's made a mistake actively that's dangerous, alerting them to, swerving into something. And so they actually went through the process of having the horn be signaled inside the car first through validation to make sure that the drivers inside, Google employees, thought that they were doing a good job. And now they've indicated that they're actually doing it on the roads. And so, it's one of those things that if it was all self-driving cars that were perfectly connected, it would not be needed to have horns. But because these cars are going to go through an integration period of mixing with cars being driven by humans, they have to behave in certain flawed ways as well. And the same way that humans do, and one of those ways is through horns. And so these little self-driving cars have horns in them, not because the human's going to tap it, but because the computer will use it as a way to signal to the other human drivers.
So what you're saying is basically for them to survive on the streets of New York or Boston or LA, they will also have to have an animatronic arm that can extend a middle finger towards other drivers?
Well, actually, one of the things they also said in the paper that was fascinating was that it's geography-based reasoning. So certain areas, horns are more important, like New York and Boston, and so the cars being driven there are more aggressive in using their horns than they are in California.
Yeah, as someone who moved from downtown Boston to Seattle, I can tell you it is radically different when you move across the country. Yeah.
But also in the driving policy of how you merge, how you take a left, what happens when you come to 4 stop signs, how do you be aggressive or not?
The thank you wave, and
all of those things. Yeah. So those are all being worked in. So on the prototype, one of the other things they were saying that they've been doing on the cars is having redundant driving system and redundant braking. So,
what does that mean?
So there's motors that actually will turn the steering column, which then turns the wheels. And most cars just have one power steering, because if it fails, the human driver can, it's as if the power steering is gone and they can drive, right? But in a self-driving world, and it's fully autonomous, if that one motor fails, then the car would be kaput. And so they now have a dual driving system and braking. So there's 2 braking systems as well. So if the primary brakes fail, there's backup. Similar to what happens in airplanes, where there's multiple layers of redundancy for all primary systems. And no vehicle to date commercially had really been produced in that manner. And so Google needed to start doing that because their cars don't have steering wheels and don't have brakes. They just have an emergency shutoff. So that model is this little pod. It only goes 25 miles an hour right now, so it's intended for cities. And that world is very much, you summon it, you get in it, it takes you where you want to go, and you get out. It is, the taxi of the future, the Johnny Cab of the future. And
it's like the most friendly looking vehicle you can imagine. It is kawaii to the max.
Yeah, and I think that is what's going to happen first from a fully autonomous world. Those will be operating in a city somewhere, probably Mountain View first, or San Francisco, or New York, and you will be able to summon one of these from Google's app or Uber, and that's it. And you get in and you get out and you're done. You don't own it. And that way that if there's any issues, the manufacturer can fix them. They don't have to worry about sort of this backward compatibility problem, because they can always just destroy all of them if they want to, if they need to repair something or fix something, like it's under their control. And they are completely liable for it anyways, because it's their vehicle. They didn't sell it to someone. They're also the operator. So it's a fully integrated model. And in a fully integrated model, they're responsible anyways. The same way Uber and Airbnb and all these folks take out their own insurance policies, because the drivers and the riders are not going to tolerate having it be on their own insurance on that system.
And I think the way that almost sounds municipal to me too.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of sounds like how a bus system might operate or a subway system that we have right now.
Yep.
And why does that? I mean, I guess why does it have to be municipal? Why does it have to be private? I think that opens into a lot of public good areas.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's interesting is Tesla has both hinted, and we've talked about this in the past, hinted at the fact that they may get into ride sharing and that they're in a good position to do that. And also that Elon Musk currently believes there's a better system than a bus, and he hasn't revealed what it is.
There's the understatement of the year.
Yeah, I guess that's not that revealing.
I would be willing to bet $1 million that I do not have that someone can come up with something better than a bus.
I bet you're right, and I would not want to be on the other side of that bet. That even you could, that both of us could figure that out. But it is sort of this idea of sort of these little pods coming together and moving in concert and coming off. So, yeah, I feel like there's definitely a lot of work on the future of what these cars will look like. Even Mercedes has some concept cars that they showed off at CES that are very sleek. And
they had it driving around San Francisco last summer too.
Yeah, they had, and it was a sort of silver bullet style thing, and the front passenger and driver seat swiveled around so you could sort of talk to people in behind. So,
and it had the blue lights too. Why is every electronic vehicle or electric vehicle have to have blue accents or blue lights or something blue on it?
I mean, blue is the future, the sci-fi future look.
Totally.
People want to feel like this is a future car.
It's
today.
A blue sky scenario, Caleb.
Literally. So yeah, I feel like we've covered a lot tonight, and don't want to push the limits of the commute time podcast.
I still think it's not dry. I think there's more autopilot to talk about.
All right, I think we might have another one brewing, and we'll see what the next episode is. But yeah, for anyone who has any feedback, where can they let us know, Mike?
They can hit us up at our subreddit at r/The Tesla Show, or on Twitter at The Tesla Show.
That's it.
I'm not sure why I just went into morning DJ mode right there.
Well,
and you can hit us at The Tesla Show.
That's true.
Yeah, we'll cut that out in post.
We will not. Okay. Talk to you later, Mike.
All right. See ya.
Bye.